Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories, but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Podcasts share their desert island drugs and joyful patient stories. Thanks for joining us.
Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. I'm a pharmacist and executive coach from South Wales. As usual, I'm joined by my fellow apothecaries STC in Bournemouth and Gimmo in Cardiff. For those of you that joined us for the first episode, thank you and welcome back. It was good to get the first one in the can. Difficult to believe, I know, but we've been recommissioned for a second episode, and so here we are. To our first-time listeners, a warm welcome to you too. What is the Oral Apothecary Podcast and why have we started it? Well, it's one of those projects and ideas that's been on the list for a while. You know the list, the one that says, write a book, do a triathlon, join a choir, learn how to vaccinate, start a podcast. And so here we are. We're aiming to bring you some honest and authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK. It's the type of continuing professional development that takes place in the pub. The type of pub-based CPD that doesn't get you struck off your professional register. We will take on topical and controversial stories, but keep it edgy yet light-hearted. Over the coming episodes, we will welcome guest speakers from the world of medicines, healthcare and pharmaceuticals. On all occasions, we'll be looking to bring our guests down to our level. As you will discover, it's work in progress. We have lots of fun pulling it all together. We record it live in one take with very limited editing. We hope you like it, but we're not really here to be liked. It's been great to hear from you with all your messages of support and how much you enjoyed episode 1. Plus, thank you for all your suggestions for our continuous improvement programme. We are working our way through them. Gimmo has got himself a new microphone. The "it's a bit blokey" comment is proving a tricky one though. If you didn't enjoy the first episode, wait until you hear this one. So, coming up in today's pod, we will hear from our special guest who will share their desert island drugs, select a career anthem to add to the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist and add a book into the Oral Apothecary library. We will also have a brief discussion on the latest thinking evidence on multimorbidity and polypharmacy. That's the CPD bit. So welcome STC and welcome Gimmo. STC, what have you been up to since we last hooked up?
Well, actually this week I've been looking quite a lot into the new English NHS discharge medicine service, which is due to start in February. So we've actually been learning from Wales because you boys have been doing it since 2011, actually, I think, haven't you?
Yeah, the Discharge Medicine Review.
Yeah, so it's going to be an essential service in England. So there isn't any doubt that we need to do it, and it'll be great for patients, but I don't think there's any doubt there's going to be quite a lot of bumps in the road. I think it's going to really test the PCNs, as in locally, for the communication that's required between the community pharmacists and the general practitioners and hopefully the pharmacy teams that work in there. So I'm absolutely confident it's going to work eventually, but I'm absolutely sure that there'll be some local issues that need to be sorted out. So hence why we're starting to look into it now.
Okay, thanks STC. Gimmo, what have you been up to?
Mostly COVID work, but been looking at Valparate this week as part of a piece on safety and doom. But actually, the thing I'm most proud of today was sat down with my daughter and we did one of her physics tests together, and I got 12 out of 12. So I just wanted to put it out there that I still haven't lost my scientific background. It's year 7, but I was pretty pleased with that.
How many did she get?
12. Ask me anything on forces.
Well, there's a reason why I didn't go into optometry, it's because I was rubbish at physics.
Okay, thank you both. Welcome again. Right, let's move straight on. We promised you pace on these podcasts, and so I'm going to hand over to STC, who is going to welcome our first guest on the Oral Apothecary. STC?
Yep, so I would like to introduce to the Oral Apothecary Clare Howard, who I've worked with quite a bit since I moved down to the south coast, and she has a long and distinguished career in pharmacy, which she might not want me to say, but I know she does say that she did start working in a pharmacy when she was 16. So she has spent a lot of time working in a pharmacy. Obviously, you never mention a lady's age, but she has worked in community pharmacy, hospital, primary care, and was actually the Deputy Chief Pharmaceutical Officer for a while as well in England. And she now is essentially the head of Medicines Optimisation and Clinical Director at Wessex Academic Health Science Network. And that's really where I first came upon Clare, and we've worked together on things around polypharmacy and deprescribing. So Clare, welcome to the Oral Apothecary.
Thank you, guys. I'm delighted to be here and honoured to be your first guest.
Well, it was essential for us after 350-something blokes. We needed to make sure that we balanced up the books. It was an easy choice that we wanted to have a lady on, but I said, come on, let's get Clare on. She'll be great. So what we're going to ask our guests, as well as the idea of the desert island drugs and the book and the song, is bar COVID, what is your number one thing in your inbox at the minute?
Steve, I think for me it's a little bit related to COVID, but all of the patients, particularly the older patients out there at the moment on high-risk medicines or multiple medicines, where we know that prior to COVID, through the work particularly we've been doing in Wessex, we've got a fairly accurate snapshot that of over 200 practices. That we had over 31,000 patients already that were potentially at risk from clinically significant medication errors. So due a medication review or due a blood test. And that was pre-COVID. And I think we know that over the last year or so, many of those older patients are at home. Phlebotomy services were stood down in the early days, and we've not been routinely calling those patients in for review. So I think as we emerge, it's going to be really important for primary care to have systems in place, not just to find the patients, that's kind of straightforward with tools like Pincer and the polypharmacy comparators, but how are we going to prioritise those patients? How do we make sure that vulnerable patients, patients from deprived backgrounds, for example, are prioritised for our support, as well as older patients and those who we know are clinically at risk? And I think that's going to be an enormous challenge because we won't be able to see all of those patients on day one when we start to get normal services back up and running.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned Pincer there, and that was one of the things I was thinking of when you said that. We haven't exactly had it in Wales, but we looked at some similar stuff. Is that a thing where you are? Is that something that's being thought of? Because that sort of risk stratification tool seem to be what you want.
So across England, the academic health science networks who were put in place in England to support the system to develop innovation and scale and spread evidence-based practice. So across the HSNs over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working to deploy Pincer across all of those practices. And it's still patchy. We've still got a lot of work to do, but certainly in my part of the world, in Wessex, we've got about 94% of practices now using it. So that snapshot is really pretty accurate in terms of the volume of work. And I'm keen that practices do another baseline post-COVID so we get a really, really good picture. And then we work with our PCNs, our primary care networks, to say, OK, this is a big workload, we need to address this and we need to do it in a fairly systematic way, understanding that we just won't be able to see everybody straight away. So how do we get that priority and risk stratification done really well, really accurately, so we see those most in need?
So I don't think I'm breaking any confidences by saying that where I'm working, I can confirm that, as you might have expected, we were doing really well before COVID in the numbers of patients, for example, who were on the Pincer hazardous prescribing list. And when I looked at it only last month, of course, it's gone up again quite significantly because, as you've said, people can't come for blood or the blood services are not available. So I know that you and I share this view that, we are going to need to get back on the horse in relation to that, and all the stuff that certainly in England we're trying to do around structured medication reviews. Again, we have continued that, but people are less willing to come in, even though we've then turned to doing some on video and on telephone, etc. But I think it is the role of clinical pharmacists in general practice to what I call keep the well. And I think the GPs agree that the longer we don't try to keep up with that, then we're going to have those additional strains on the NHS service. Yeah, it's a really big challenge, and I don't have all the answers.
And it's interesting that Pincer might, this is something that might give us a measure of, because obviously it's a worry, isn't it, how much general healthcare has been missed during COVID, and I wonder if this is something that can give us an indication of that.
And as Steve was saying, before COVID, so in my neck of the woods, we'd reduced that at-risk list by over 3,500. So we'd made big inroads into that list. But I'm looking at the practices who've done a second download, and you can see that things have gone backwards. So an evidence-based tool like that's been used in hundreds and hundreds of practices now feels like a very good place to start, as opposed to everybody creating searches and we don't get that big picture. Because systems will have to commission phlebotomy services differently in light of some of this data and think about how we sort of put some of that together. So it's big picture stuff, and you need really good data to support those decisions.
While we've got Claire on, and can I ask you about your polypharmacy action learning sets, Claire, without putting you on the spot too much? I've heard little bits about them from Steve. What's the background to those, and they sound like a success?
Yeah, sure. We're learning. I think Steve, Zoe, and I that teach on them would say, it's an evolving process. But essentially, we took a gem of an idea that came from Yorkshire and evolved that, and we've now got well over 100 GPs and pharmacists who've been through the process, and we've evaluated that. And essentially, we take them on a journey of 3 action learning sets. We talk to them about what data is available to find patients at risk from problematic polypharmacy. We then do quite a lot of work on shared decision making and things like Montgomery rules, and how do you help patients decide when to take a medicine, but also understand what's important to patients in order to reduce some of that pill burden. And we take them through that process. And by the end of the 3rd action learning set, we're joined by local geriatricians to talk through really giving confidence to clinicians to stop medicines. I think a lot of the time clinicians know that either the patients aren't coping with the volume, or they're not really taking the medicines and don't understand it. But that nervousness to stop a statin, or it's a real barrier. And hopefully this work is starting to make some chip in away at that.
So that treatment burden that you mentioned, that's a term that is just recurring more and more in the literature now, isn't it? Can I just take you back to the actual action learning for our listeners? Can you just explain what action learning sets are for those of them that aren't familiar with it?
So action learning is a type of learning that's particularly geared up to complex problems where there isn't you do X, Y, and Z and you'll solve polypharmacy. So polypharmacy really lent itself to action learning sets. You take a group that work together, that get to know each other. There's peer support, as well as some didactic sessions. And you see in the cohort, they move along this journey from not feeling very confident to stop medicines to feeling more confident. But it's perfect for something as complex as polypharmacy, because there isn't a silver bullet for this. This is about changing systems, learning from one another, and doing things differently with patients. And that's big stuff for prescribers.
Okay, so hey, enough of the heavy stuff, Claire. The reason for coming on, obviously, onto the Oral Apothecary is to give us your desert island drugs. And as you know, this is something that we use in the polypharmacy learning set. And I know you loved it when I first suggested that we might do it. So what would you like to offer up? And as you know, it's about a drug that would evoke something quite powerful for you. So what would you like to offer the Oral Apothecary as your desert island drug?
Thanks, Steve. So, God, this is really difficult when you actually have to do it yourself. So my first choice is methadone. I was a community pharmacist in the mid-90s, and I was running needle exchange schemes, and I was working in Stratford-upon-Avon, which, you might think of as a kind of middle-class market town without a heroin problem, but you'd be wrong. And it was a really, really big issue. And I think for me, doing needle exchange and starting to get involved in substance misuse services, you just sort of realise it, especially at that period of time, middle 90s, those patients, HIV patients with substance misuse problems, they just weren't afforded the same sort of support and care that other groups of patients were. Yeah. And so in my little community pharmacy, I had a consultation room, well before it was mandatory. And so being in a confined space, swapping needles with those patients and supervising their methadone, you get to know those patients pretty well. They weren't a massively different age group to me. And so you just sort of get this sense of, nobody wakes up in the morning to become addicted to heroin. And so some of them I worked really carefully with. And at the time when I inherited some of them, they were taking the methadone, they were selling it around the back, and they were still injecting the heroin. And I think what I'm really proud of is that by getting to know some of those patients and working with them, I moved them from a position of injecting to not injecting anything and taking the methadone orally, and got some of them down to quite nice low maintenance doses. I didn't ever get anybody off and clean, but I do hope that there are patients out there from that group that are living healthy lives now because of some of that work. So that had to be my first choice.
Well, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, that's great, because I can remember, you said sort of the 90s, and I can remember sort of in the early 90s, and we started to do needle exchange, and actually it's It's one of those things that pharmacy is quite a conservative profession, and some of the attitudes around that time towards people taking drugs was, I would argue, not very professional. So those of us who were doing those services were often on our own because lots of people just didn't want to do it and thought it was the wrong thing to do. So that's a nice sort of description of how far we've come, because it would be deemed unprofessional for saying that now, and rightly so. Back then, I mean, I remember setting up a needle exchange thing, and it was people really sort of had views about people involved in it that weren't very nice.
Absolutely. And I'd started out, as Steve said earlier, I was a 16-year-old Saturday girl in Wigan, and I think you get a real taste of life in a pharmacy in Wigan at that age, that actually, some of this stuff people